Hi, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm the host of this show and a potential Green Party candidate for governor of Maryland in 2026. I'm using this show to highlight interesting people and ideas that help me and you to understand what is happening and what is possible. You can learn more about the campaign by going to gogreen2026.com. Guests on this show do not necessarily support my campaign or the Green Party. They've agreed to come on to discuss ideas and issues. And of course, click the subscribe button on YouTube so you can keep up to date with this podcast. Renee Johnston has been an educator and a union member for over 2 decades. She currently serves as a committee chair of the Global Pan-African Movement, North America, and the Green Party of New Jersey, for which she is a registered member. Renee can be found on Black Power Media on the I Mix What I Like show, Saturdays with Renee. She is also a new member of the Black Alliance for Peace. She's a rabbit hole researcher, a political education event organizer, and a budding writer. Hello and welcome to the Go Green 2026 podcast. Tonight we're going to be talking about cop cities and reimagining public safety. The concept of public safety has been thrust into the national discussion, at least in the last year, as private, public, and nonprofit forces have lined up to build a massive police training facility in Atlanta. The community opposition to this project and the lengths that elected Democrats and Republicans will go in order to repress and crush the movement against this police facility has once again shown the way both parties are invested in policing as their main mechanism to envision public safety, protect property, and stop protest. Here in Maryland, Democratic Governor Wes Moore is offering an all-of-the-above approach to public safety, which seeks to hire and train more police, lock up more so-called violent criminals, including children, and to use a public health approach to preventing gun violence. We've done previous shows focused on the tough on crime and public health approaches to gun violence aspects of his strategy, and tonight we're taking on the train more police aspects of the Democratic governor's strategy. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm looking forward to digging deep into this aspect of that Democrat and Republican policy on policing. And with that, let's bring Renee in and get to it. Hey, Renee, how are you doing?
Hey, Andy, how are you?
I'm good. You know, it's been a busy week, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation and then the one that we're going to have on Saturday.
Very much looking forward to it. Yes, yes.
Excellent. Well, let's get right in because I know you gotta stop when we in a little over an hour, and we got a lot of questions to get through. So, you've been doing a lot of research about cop cities, and before we dive into the details and go down those rabbit holes that we both like to go down, um, can you talk about what a cop city about that research that you've done and what it means for democracy to have all these cop cities? And can you give us an introduction about how you got into that work?
um, I mean, getting into it, it was pure nosiness, right? Like, I like to try to get people to understand I'm not really a researcher, right? I work in a high school. But if I find something that I think is interesting that I can't figure out why there's no answer to, I tend to start digging in until I can figure out if I can find an answer to that question. And this Cop City question is one that I feel like, and I still don't know all the answers, but it was enough of a question of trying to figure out how many of these things are actually happening right now that it was worth me taking the time to kind of comb through all the information that I could find to see what I could pull together. Now, admittedly, the term cop cities, I think, for some of the places that I found, it's overstated, right? It's not actually a cop city, right? It's not a huge facility where it's taken over, you know, a landmass and all those things. Now, some of them are, but not all of them are. But what I found is this this consistency of our police need this new place, be it a new place to surveil, be it a new place to shoot their guns, be it a new place to sit around and eat donuts because they need a brand new department building, whatever it was. And it all went on the list because in my mind, no matter how small the space was or how little, if you can consider, like $8 million little, um, the facility was, it was still a resource, it was still money, it was still time, it was still bids, it was still energy put towards funding the police state. And for me, I always see anything that goes into funding the police state as antithetical to community, right? Like it doesn't, they want to sell everybody on this idea that we need to have, every resource we can have for our police departments, for our police officers, and all these things. And the thing that would most actually help public safety would be to provide actual resources to the community and not to your police department and your police officers and your armed agents of the state. So because of that, I did include every facility or project that I found, be it a small project that was, it's a brand new police department and therefore they have to tear up ground and build a brand new police department building. If it was a shared public safety facility where both the police and the firefighters were going to be using the same space to train, no matter what, if it was an expansion of a building that already existed, like no matter what the reason behind this building was happening, I put it on the list. The only caveat that I did make was it had to be opened or planned to be opened after 2020.
Mhm.
So that was my like line in the sand of when I started searching. So I did find about 5 facilities that, based on what I read and the notes that I found from city council notes or whatever have you, it appeared the planning started before 2020. But if it's still currently under construction or it didn't open its doors until 2021 or 2022, I really had a hard time convincing myself that my timeline of 2020 didn't have some kind of effect on that particular project. So I went ahead and added it. And the differential, if you look at the map, is that those 5 locations, the map is blue. The flag on the map is blue, where all the other ones are black, so that I could make sure that I was clear in my analysis for what how I identified different locations.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And it's like 2020, I think, was a really interesting year. It wasn't the moment that it started. It came at the end of a series of years of protest during the
Right.
Black Lives Matter movement. But I think that the Democrats in 2020 took this approach, which was trying to appease the part of their base that wanted to defund the police and appease the part of their base that wanted to have more police. And so they came up with this sort of like three part approach to it, which is lock up violent criminals, come up with nonprofit alternatives for other folks, and train more cops. And this part of the training more cops aspect of it is really interesting because that's where a lot of the money goes, especially if we're talking about these big capital projects. And then I want to get into what you found about some of the research in a moment, but before that, with one part of the framework we use on this show and in this campaign to analyze policy is a rooting in history to understand why the
Mm-hmm.
confrontation we have with the now is the confrontation we have with the now. And so let's ground this discussion in history. Can you let us know the history of policing that informs your analysis, to the degree that it helps to put a spotlight on this project? And I know we could do a whole show just on this, but
We
to
could.
get the conversation started here, what's the history of policing that helps you to locate what is happening right now? Um,
Right. Um, so the reality of the creation of police forces is they were not created to serve and protect the community and the members of the community from any kind of harm. It had nothing to do with public safety. And um, I speak a lot about, the slave catchers, because that was a huge part of the initial police forces down in the South. They were set up to scare slaves, to stop them from gathering, to catch slaves. They chased people down to different areas of the country to drag them back to their slave owners. Um, in addition to that, there were also police forces that were started to stop working people from unionizing In London, the police force was created to protect the rich manors and to make sure that, the peons didn't steal anything or get onto property where they weren't supposed to be. Um, but because of the trajectory of policing, which has continued really to focus so heavily on Black and brown bodies, it's really hard to separate it fully from the slave catching aspect. And a lot of people speak on that as the history, and it is a huge part of the history of policing. But I always like to make sure, note now, and it's funny, I'm doing these monthly abolition workshop groups with a group of other organizers in New Jersey, and we just did this topic. And part of the presentation was the history of policing. Thank you, Annalise. And so, one of the things we talked about is how grossly misunderstood what policing is, right, to the broader population. There's so much propaganda, there's so many movies, there's so many TV shows, and everything is to present this idea that, policing at its core is about like serving and protecting and taking care of your neighbor and making sure everybody's safe. And it literally, the history of it has nothing to do with that. The history of policing has always been at its core to protect property and to protect the owners of that property. It is literally that simple.
And I think there's a lot of this that is sort of the mundane way that Black and brown communities are not safe and over policed at the same time, the sort of everyday aspect of it.
Right.
But there's also the sort of spectacular aspect of it when there's an uprising or an insurgency in an urban area and the police are called in to shut that down. Can you talk a little bit about the way about the history of policing and suppressing uprisings, insurgencies, and radical political movements in Black and brown communities? We're in Baltimore, so we had a most recent uprising in 2015.
Right.
I know,
After Freddie Gray was murdered. Mm-hmm.
Yep, after Freddie Gray was murdered, and in the Newark had a big insurrection and uprising in the 60s,
Mm-hmm.
and much of it seems like much of modern policing in urban areas is doing the two aspects. It is the sort of mundane, everyday, everyday over policing.
And harassment of people just going about their day.
Yeah. And then the sort of when there is a moment of political action or popular resistance, they're there to crush that. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's all part of the same problem, right? So if you decide as a community that you're going to get together and you're going to stand up to in the face of these armed agents of the state to represent the contradiction that they are, to call out the falseness of their role, to call out the fact that it's not one bad apple, it's an entire rotten ground tree, everything, right? Um, their job is to prevent you from presenting that side of things, right? It doesn't help the police propaganda if an entire community comes forward and says, there are too many of you, you're all armed, all you do is harass us, then you kill us, and then you get mad at us for coming out and saying these are the things that you're doing, right? So it's all part of silencing any attempt to move the idea forward that what we believe about policing is not the reality of policing, because they have to maintain their propaganda. It is absolutely important that any attempt to present that truth does not get far. So they don't want large mass protests, right? They don't want communities to actually end up on mainstream media where someone who can speak logically and tell a full story about what's happening can actually tell it. They want the headlines that the newspaper is going to give, that man was shot, knife found, right? But we're not going to talk about the fact that he was shot in the kitchen, and who doesn't have a knife in their kitchen, right? So these are the things that they can avoid if they can crush any ability for people to truly gather and have those conversations. And it's also part of really making sure that there is no radical ideology that moves forward in a community, right? So if you even go back to, any, and you can pick one out of the air, right? Of a voice of someone who was speaking against the state and trying to give an honest analysis of what people are actually trying to survive and trying to live with. And the end result is that person probably was taken out by the state specifically because their role is to make sure that we all remain under their control and without the ability to work together to actually push and fight and gain control over our own safety.
Yeah, and it's interesting that coming out of 2020, the sort of liberal response was to recognize the excesses of policing, at least in words, and to say what we need to do is to better train police, and thus we need to build these facilities to better train them. But the reality is those facilities are also training them to do the kind of urban combat that we saw in 2020, where they are aggressively and violently repressing nonviolent protest. And it is, it's a good marketing gimmick in some ways. This, we need to train police better. It is a good marketing gimmick by Democrats and by liberal folks to actually funnel money toward the violent repression under a different name. And I think that starts to get into some of the research that you did on cop cities. And we watched this National Lawyers Guild webinar that you did a couple of weeks ago, and it was excellent. And we'll definitely link it in the comments here. But can we start with this about how, as we dive into your research, how did you define cop cities in your research and what is included? You talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but let's just understand the methodology of inclusion and exclusion as we start to dive into this.
Right. So the full list of when I pulled up, okay, which ones exactly, like what exactly am I going to put on this list as I'm trying to figure out, like, how am I defining this? And it was any facility that I found where there were plans that I could definitively outline to build, if there were plans to attempt to build, if construction had begun, or if the facility was open. And it was anything in any state. I went alphabetically, and it included if that was still in the assessment phase, if it was in the planning phase, if it had been approved for construction, if construction was ongoing, again, if it had been opened, or if it was a renovation or an expansion of a training facility, an academy, a police department. I included everything. And as I was telling you before, the reason for that is because any of those things, when you read through the documents, right, it takes up space, it takes up money, and it takes up a resource that could be used for something else. So I felt like I didn't want to leave anything out, right? And I've gotten some pushback from people, like, oh, this place in Maine, this is ridiculous that you added this. They were just renovating their police department. This doesn't need to be on there. And so my pushback is, okay, that's what you say, but Ellsworth, Maine has like 8,500 people who live there. So why do they need an 8,500 square foot police department? Right? And why are they spending millions of dollars to renovate a space like that in Maine? Like, why? You mean to tell me there's nothing better that the people in that area could have gained with those millions of dollars that they put towards this process? And so I didn't want to leave any place out. And I tried my best, and when you read the write-up of the methodology, to really lay that out so people understand. As we all know, a lot of people just look at stuff. They don't really read the things, right? So,
right.
it's laid out, but I don't think, I think people kind of dismiss the fact that I tried to be very, very clear in what is on the map, so that they understood that it did encompass all of these things, and that was intentional.
Right. And it's not like I can't imagine that every school in Ellsworth, Maine, every park, every other public system is doing great, and they just had a bunch of money to get rid of, and they decided that the last thing they were going to do was to renovate the police station.
Right. That was the last thing that was missing. And We just got to do it, and we got to find this $4 million to make sure it gets done, right? Like, that's not a small amount of money, right?
Right.
I mean, how old are your books?
Right.
When's the
Like
last time the air conditioning in the school was updated? Like,
ex- exactly. And like, we're all of the residents so eager to give up their money that they had to spend this last one thing on getting the,
right,
it's just,
right,
I think including everything there is really useful because it actually allows these debates to occur.
right,
It allows the question to occur about investing in police training at places where it is not Nashville or Atlanta or Newark or Baltimore, but it is instead the day to day investment in maintaining this structure. And I think that's as important to include. So, aside from a small police station in Maine that is still worth talking about, um, what did you find? How many of these are around the country, and which ones were most notable to you?
So I found a total of 69. And, you know, when I created the map, it was really me understanding that for a lot of people, sitting down and looking at a really long spreadsheet of links and words and numbers was just going to be too much, right? So I created the map literally so there would be this visual. I don't think I quite understood how jarring it was going to be as a visual until I finished it, right? Once I had like double checked the last link to make sure, and I kind of sat back and said, okay, I'm done. And then I stopped for a second and I looked at it and I was like, holy, like, wait a minute, right? They're literally everywhere except for 3 states. So there's 69 projects that I found. As I said earlier, there were five of those 69 that, you know, per what the information that I was able to uncover were projects that quasi started before 2020. I do think there's probably more of those projects where there were inklings and nudgings that they were going to try and do something prior to 2020, but I'm fairly confident that if it's under construction now, or if the bond was solidified in 2021, that, you know, what happened in 2020 played a role in it. Um, the most expensive project is, I think it's $415 million. That's down in Nashville. It's a 800-acre facility that they're looking to to build up. Another really big one is in Hershey, Pennsylvania. That's a 366,000 square foot facility. Everyone, I think, at this point is familiar with Atlanta and what's going on there. Um, Baltimore, as I know you know, has this plan for Coppin State. That's a $330 million project. Newark has a $300 million project with 4 buildings that they're trying to put up. The first one's already under construction. Um, so it's a lot, and it's a lot of money. For some projects, the money was, I couldn't find it. Now, again, it could be because I'm not a researcher and I wasn't really sure like where exactly to look. It could be that it was hidden really well and that's why it couldn't be found. There are a couple of places that are, there's one place that's actually a private facility. Um, so I'm not likely, I mean, maybe somebody else can try and find it, but it's probably completely not going to happen that you'd be able to track down where the money came from for this. But it is positioned as a training facility for police and military. So
Mhm.
even if it's private, you have to put it on there because this private training is a massive part of the problem, outside of what policing is to begin with. But in Chicago, the facility that was put up is a national de-escalation program, which, as we know, that's worked really well. And de-escalation by police is like commonplace. Um, so, but it in the end it was jarring. It really like, even for me who had been doing it, right? Like, I started out, I had like a couple of dozen. That convinced me that I needed to look in every state. when I got invited to do the National Lawyers Guild, I went back to confirm the 47 that I found on the initial spreadsheet and then ended up with 68, 67. And then I got a link to an article about Lacey Washington. I didn't even know Lacey Washington was a thing. Now I found the 4 regional police training facilities they were planning to open, but I didn't know Lacey Washington was part of the plan. So then you have to add Lacey Washington. Now you're at 68. And while I'm doing that, I catch wind that they're fighting in Philadelphia because they want to, build another facility in downtown Philadelphia, even though they just built a brand new police department, I think in like 2019, right? So it's a lot.
Did you were you able to get a total of how much money is on the table?
So, I did not do the math on that. And I probably should have, but it's in the billions easily.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fascinating that in response to widespread movements against policing and a global insurrection after George Floyd's murder, the response of Democrats and Republicans alike is to expand police budgets by billions of dollars by investing in these training facilities. And I often will say in Maryland, there's two things that have bipartisan support in Maryland, and that is unlimited support for Israel and unlimited support for the police. And these are sort of the two areas where Democrats and Republicans are in lockstep and in convergence.
And if you think about it, they're not really two separate areas.
Right.
So,
they're very interconnected. And that was a question I was going to ask too about future possibilities of this is, have you thought about the way or looked into the way that some of these same people who are commissioning these centers are going to turn their eyes globally and start building these centers in places that are, very dependent on the U.S.?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if they need to. I mean, we got how many, 800 and something military bases all over the world. I don't know that you need. I think honestly that the US is actually more looking like a military installment versus what the US is doing internally being a blueprint for what it's going to do internationally. It's already trying to police the world. Yep. And it's doing so by putting up military bases all over the world, surrounding areas that it finds to be troublesome and making sure that they don't really give full information about why we need to have it there. So similarly, you look around, you look on the map, Minneapolis is surrounded, right? You have certain, the East Coast is completely bombarded. You have multiple projects going in different places. And, I didn't dig super deep into it because I'll be honest, this was an overwhelming project for someone who's not a researcher, right? But as I was going, I was having, making my mental notes, like, how close are these things to the Black people and the brown people and the indigenous people, right? How many of them are also going to serve the military? Because for some, it was very clear, like this is going to be dual police and military. Don't know that just because it didn't say it, it won't be, right? How many of these places are going to participate in these international trainings, because that's a huge part of funding, right? Like police departments request federal funding so they can send their officers to go train in Israel for 2 weeks with the Gilly program, right? So I really actually think it's the other way around. I really think it's not a plan for what we're going to do. It's bringing what we've been doing back home.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I remember back 2007, 2008, Dylan Rodriguez wrote an article about the way that prisons were one of the things that the U.S. was exporting to Afghanistan at the time. So as the U.S. was trying to remake Afghanistan in its image, it was investing a bunch of money to invest in police stations and prisons in Afghanistan. Not that there weren't prisons there already, but that they were making them like U.S. prisons, and that they were bringing in private consulting groups in order to do that. And it was part of the folks who were contractors. Same thing happened in Iraq, and Dylan Rodriguez is telling of it. And it's just an interesting thought about like when the United States decides to destroy and then rebuild another country, one of the things that comes with it is its police and its prisons, because that's how they regulate, that's how they ensure the free flows of capital and suppress the resistance.
Right.
Yeah, I'll send you that. I think it's interesting. And
I'd like to read that. Yeah.
And I will say, I'm a person that loves a spreadsheet. So I will dive into your spreadsheet, but we will share the map and the spreadsheet and the comments of this so everybody can check out whether they like the map or the spreadsheet better. They can check out your research.
I should do a poll. Which did you prefer, the map or the spreadsheet?
Yeah, I am voting for the spreadsheet any day, but
yeah,
I understand.
It's a lot. It's a lot to look at. It's a lot.
Yeah, but it's really useful. When I looked at it, I thought it was a really, really valuable tool, really valuable piece of political education to help people understand what's going on with this, and the degree to which that investment has occurred since 2020. I think that's the important part of it, is the time-boundness of it makes it so extraordinary. And I think about this in terms of like when the We Charge Genocide petition was authored in 1951, I think they only used things that had happened since the Genocide Convention had occurred. And I think those type of tools that say, we're going to take a time from the very recent past and chart what has happened since then, have a really powerful illuminating ability, because I think people can say, yeah, it's always been this way, or yeah, such and such, or it's getting better now. But what your research shows is not getting better. It's getting way worse. The response to 2020 was to invest massively in police buildings, capital facilities, and training facilities to make sure that they have a permanent presence in communities that is never going away.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I want to talk about, we talked a little bit about the, you mentioned the Baltimore facility. And so I want to use that facility to contextualize some of this locally, and then give a chance for you to explain what you found around projects around the nation that relate to it. So a report came out last year that said, that outlined plans for a $330 million public safety training facility on the campus of Coppin State University, which is a historically Black college and university in West Baltimore. And one thing that I found really interesting was the recommendations about funding in this, because the study identifies a few sources of potential funding for the $330 million. That's a lot of money that this costs. And they fall into three basic categories: public monies, nonprofit and foundation funding, and private and corporate funding. So what I want to do is sort of go through each of these funding sources and talk about what your research found, what it means, and what it and the concerns you have about it. So let's start with the public money. They outline a whole bunch of sort of different grants from levels of government, and even suggest an income tax that could be increased in order to fund this to fund this facility. What did you find about the public funds for these things, where they're coming from, and what the trend there is?
So anything that was built, if I remember correctly, did get some kind of public funding, right? And it was either they got money from the state, they got money from the federal government, often through those COVID relief bills, or it was a bond that the town had to vote on, or sometimes the town said no and they said, okay, we'll find the money from somewhere else. But typically, it's not even necessarily an increase of taxes, but looking towards the monies that already come and flow into that particular district or city or whatever have you, via the local community, the state, or the federal government providing those funds to be used for that purpose. So that was a pretty steady through line, unless I couldn't find the money at all, which did happen for a couple of things. I couldn't find it. So
I'll send you the page where I'll send you the appendix from the Baltimore report about the funding because it's fascinating. It is them telling on themselves in all sorts of ways.
I believe it.
It sort of says things like, we're going to need to use massive amounts of public funding for this, and the community, like in Atlanta, is going to oppose us doing that. So we are going to need to get the political capital together in order to convince the politicians in the community that this is a good investment for them, And it is like, they know, right? And but yeah, I'll send it to you. It's fascinating. It is it references Atlanta, and it sort of says Atlanta has a comparable project to the one that we're trying to build in Baltimore, and it's and they got the funding together for it, but then the people got mad, and now it's in trouble. And it is like, well, that's one way of telling that story, yeah.
Right. But and the bonds, excuse me, the bonds are something that I found in a lot of places where, we'll just do a tax, we'll just do a bond and we'll use a bond and, and I wonder often, do people understand, like, when they do these bonds, like, it's a debt, right? Like, it's not free money. Like, it has to come back. Like, it has to go back eventually, no matter, what they're using to fund the bond. So there's been I don't fully understand the bond process, like how it works. I just know it's not free money and it's got to be paid back eventually. And so, someone's going to have to pay that money back. And I think it's interesting that they reference Atlanta, which I knew they did, because the Atlanta project started out and it was supposed to be only like a third of it was going to be paid for by the citizens, right? Only, it wasn't going to be a ton of, it was all, it's almost all going to be private money. Don't worry about it. You're only going to have to put in like $30 million. And then when it turned out at the end, I think now the bill for the taxpayers is up to like 70 million, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's completely flipped from what they initially said. And it's because they couldn't raise enough money. They didn't have enough private donors to give money to pay for this facility. So it's an interesting, it's very interesting how these things all work. And I think what most stood out to me about the money is I listen to how often politicians tell people, well, we can't pay for that. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, we can't excuse student debt. Like, people have to pay for that. Like, we can't give everybody medical care. You have to pay for that. We can't raise wages. Like, who's paying for that? But they always find money to pay for the dumb shit, right? It's sorry, pardon my language, but like, they can find it to pay for this, right?
We can't pay for that because we're paying for this.
Right. And one of the conversations that I'm really starting to encourage is, even if you live in a place where you've discovered now that they just built this thing, or they broke ground and they're building this thing, even your worst case scenario is you can't stop it, but now you have a price point. Right. Right? Now you know that your whoever found this amount of money to do this thing. So that means they can find this amount of money to do something that's going to be useful to the community. And that's what people should be. There's always a reason to fight back. And that's going to be the reason. No matter where the project is, you have that you can fight about.
Yeah, and when the Baltimore report, I will say this about the $330 million price tag on the Baltimore report. Even the people that most wanted it saw the price, like even the electeds who were most excited for this to happen, saw the price tag and were like, "Ooh,
right."
That's a lot of money.
That's an absurd amount of money to give people a place to play and sit around and watch other people do things and harass people.
Yeah.
Right? That's a lot of money. And that doesn't include, you still have to pay salaries, right? Like, and it's absurd.
In Maryland, the idea is that having a better, so our police department in Baltimore constantly talks about how many empty slots they have and how understaffed they are. And so the training facility is part of getting them back up to the staff that they said that they want to be. So one of the reasons is if we have this nice training facility, more people will want to be cops, and we'll have to spend, and it is like, again, taking more and more of the money and allocating it to the police budget. And, it's when Governor Moore talks about this, he's talking about it as a means of filling shortages in public safety, in public safety staffing. And what that means is paying more money for more police to under safety neighborhoods and over police them. And and it is, and again, I think this is the Trojan horse of Democrats use to be able to talk about giving more money to police budgets, is talking about training. Training is their method of figuring out how to allocate those funds, because they know that half of their base doesn't want those funds allocated to aggressive policing anymore. So the means of ensuring those billions of dollars in the budget are becoming training instead of boots on the ground.
Right. And it's all smoke and mirrors, right? When all is said and done, because you build up this thing, even if training was like a valid excuse, right? Let's pretend we live in a world where police actually like serve the purpose they're supposed to serve, which is to like keep people safe, right? You build up this brand new facility. You're gonna now it's the building that's gonna bring people in, when you actually could have used that money to train more social workers, more counselors, more nurses, more EMT services. Like you could have used all of that and provided services that would have been more sufficient, even if you were doing actual training that was supporting a police. You know what I mean? Like,
or you could invest in grassroots community-led anti-violence initiatives. Like there's a lot of, you could put the money into a pool that the community has sovereignty and democratic control over in order to find the violence prevention techniques that they know work. You could do
that work best. Correct.
You could do any number of things other than building a fancy new building that, and no matter whether it is in Maine or in Baltimore, the idea is always the same. That building the fancy building will make more people want to be police. And somehow it often says, and better people will want to be police if the building is nice. And it is like, look, the barrier to the people who you call better people being police is policing, not, not the building.
It's the job. It's the job.
So staying on money for a second, one of the things that you talk about is the nonprofit and the foundation funding and the corporate and the private donations that go into that. I think that part of it, when you just said that like Atlanta was originally supposed to only be a third of it paid for with public money, I think that part should raise people's concern quite a bit, that corporations, nonprofits, foundations are all sort of working together to fund these things. Can you talk about that part a little bit?
So it's dual, right? Like, there again, it one confirms what we talked about earlier, that this police project, this armed agent of the state project, is really about protecting capital and protecting property and protecting those who have ownership of capital and property. And so it is to their benefit to spend money to uplift and support the thing that's in place to do that, right? So they would be the people who are most likely to support these types of projects. At the same time, they want profit. So the minute they, for all that Atlanta wants to pretend, the Atlanta government wants to pretend like everybody wants this thing, they couldn't even continue to convince the people who were slotted to pay for it that it was a good investment, right? Like when it all came down to it, people were like, yeah, I don't know that this is a good place to put my money, right? Like, that's literally what happened. So the people who they were about to depend on to fund this thing that was so necessary, right, were like, yeah, this ain't that great of an investment. And instead of recognizing that not even the people you think really want it are willing to invest in it, they decided they were just going to take it out on the people who already can't afford it, right? To make up for the difference for these people who are all these billionaire, billion dollar companies that don't even exist because of the people in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
It is the bizarrest, like, spider web of nonsense that you could possibly put together. And I would not be shocked to discover that this is a lot of places. There are these police associations and private foundations that support policing, and they've got hands in a lot of these, if not all of them. I just didn't have the time to fully research that. But I found evidence of enough of it, enough sheriff's departments and sheriff associations and police academy support networks and this, that, and the other thing, to know that that's going to be one of the culprits at hand. And it's always going to be the people who already have money, who want to make sure that they support this project of the state to protect their money, who are going to support these projects. And you'll have communities who go along, right? And it's not every community that people come up and say, oh, we don't want this thing. People voted on the bonds and said, yeah, we support our officers and blah blah blah. But they all think policing is about what they see on TV. But they already live in communities with resources, right? So they're not the overly police. They're standing on every corner and harassing your kid when they're walking home and throwing people to the ground for no reason and pulling people over for stupid things. Like, they don't live in those communities,
Mm-hmm.
right? So to them, they love their police officers, right? I live in a suburb. They love them cops here. They do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, they don't bother me, but my name's on the tax letter. So I don't expect them to bother me too much. But that doesn't mean that I don't recognize that that is me as someone who lives in this community. It is very different for someone who is driving through this community, and I'm fully aware of that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think, like, one of the things that the Baltimore report says about this is, like, we need to work with national groups, or we need to work with local corporate interests and foundations, but also regional and national groups in order to coordinate the political and financial backing for this, because projects like this receive a lot of scrutiny. And they sort of say, and this gets to my next question, they sort of say, we need to be able to get the community where the policing is going to occur to support it by identifying these other folks as outside agitators, basically.
Right.
And so in some of the reporting on the Coppin facility, again, West Baltimore, historically Black college and university campus, looking to host this facility. The proponents, and some even in the community, say, the police and fire need a new facility, and Coppin State wants to cooperate. It's jobs for the community. The police
That's always another one, the jobs.
Yeah, and they say, the police should train in the places where they're going to work so they can get to know the community. And they kind of say, don't worry.
Wait. They should train. Listen to that language. They should train in the place where they work so they can get to know the community. As if the community of Baltimore is getting together and hanging out in this facility. Lord. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's the thing. And I think what I'm getting at here is, I think Black Democratic politicians that are working to try to get these facilities built are using a narrative that sort of says the only people who oppose this are, people who don't live in this community and don't deal with the safety questions that we deal with. And they are just, outside agitators, and people here know they need the police and things like that. And I think they're learning the lesson from Atlanta, which is that when the community, when a diverse group of folks are united against this project, it's easy to shut one of these projects down. So they're trying to do this
Right.
division thing, which is the new tactic for them, in order to be able to say the people in West Baltimore want more policing. And I mean, I think that that's a difficult question, because I think that there's a desire, and my experience in Baltimore is that, yeah, people want their neighborhood to be safe, and um, they don't want to not be able to walk to the store, and they don't want to not be able to go outside, and some of the and there's a real unsafety that occurs in some of these in a lot of communities, and I think there's people in those communities who want their neighborhood to be safer, and the only alternatives given to them are either more police or no police. Um, and no police sounds scary to them.
Right.
And so
Right.
talk a little bit about like how to sort of deal with that turn where they're trying to get the complexities of the ground of a place like West Baltimore, where a lot of people oppose the over policing and oppose the bad policy. But the politicians are trying to say, if we just train the police better, then your neighborhood will be safer and the bad stuff won't happen.
Right. So, I mean, what you said is actually the key, right? People don't necessarily want police, they want to be safe, but they have been conditioned to believe that police means safety, right? So, when you have this conversation, when I have it, and I really had to learn how to do this reasonably, right? um, because it's a much harder conversation, because you have to convince people first that the police are not creating safety in your community, right? So if you're having this conversation with someone who lives in a West Baltimore or in a Philadelphia or in Flatbush in Brooklyn, or wherever, right? um, you have to remind people that you are already over policed and you're still feeling unsafe every single day. And that should be the critical understanding for people to realize, that there is no correlation between a really huge over policed neighborhood and a safe neighborhood, right? Because the safest neighborhoods are not over policed, they're over resourced.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you don't need to have this vast majority of people doing things to survive that may create an unsafe environment and situation for the people who also live in that community. So I think this is a major problem, and I have to credit Haydem Rivera, because he was on BPM and he was having a conversation. I think he was on Dr. Ball's show, and he said, like, people don't want to hear, like, take away the cops when they're afraid of getting carjacked, right? Afraid of getting robbed, afraid of whatever things can happen in a community where there aren't enough resources, right? Because they think, like, okay, the police, that they're there to make sure that these things don't happen. The unfortunate reality of this situation is those people, and this is most people, whether you live in a safe community or not, most people do not understand that police rarely prevent crimes from happening. You call the police when a crime has happened, right? You dial 911 because you think a crime is happening. By the time they get there, it's done, right? So this idea of safety that people think that they're gathering from these armed officers of the state, it is a perception of safety. It is not safety. And what we really have to work to do is break that perception, is to get people to understand that, really historically, and any report that has looked into whether or not more cops equal more safety, that correlation has never been made.
Mm-hmm. And I want to get to the public or the political education part of it in a minute, but I think what's fascinating is the most unsafe neighborhoods have all of the resources that the public sector is giving to them allocated toward the police and the
Right.
prison system. And
Right.
so when all of the resources that are being put into your community are being put into it to police it, it's hard to think about safety. And I think that one of the other differences between a wealthy community and a community where all the resources are being diverted into policing is that in the wealthy community, the police may not prevent crime, but they do actually try to solve the crime when it happens. Whereas
Yeah.
in the overpoliced black and brown working class neighborhoods, they're neither preventing the crimes nor solving the crimes.
Right. And then sometimes they're not showing up after the crime
And sometimes
either.
they're doing the
Right.
crimes, right?
Right. Right.
Right.
So it's this whole spectrum of uselessness
Right.
with regard to actually creating a safe environment for the people who live in the community. And it's got to be the exercise of anyone who wants to truly educate and be part of a community that does not rely on armed people who show up and escalate a situation to make it worse. It's necessary for people to understand that you have to find a better way than that, right? Every situation does not require bringing someone in with a costume and a gun. Because any other place of showing someone shows up at your door in a costume and a gun, that's not creating safety.
Right.
Right.
And with the last 15 minutes or so we have, I want to tilt in that direction and talk about the role that the political education plays in building the power in order to be able to confront these projects, but also the larger police state, and to start to build these new institutions of community safety.
Right.
So, yeah, what is, you do a regular show on Black Power Media, you go on a lot of webinars, you talk about this wherever you can. What role do you see political education playing in building that movement?
I think the biggest role it can play is to break that idea that police is about creating safety, that it's about public safety, that it's about serving and protecting, that it's just about making sure that you feel safe when you're walking down the street, because policing has nothing to do with any of that. And I think it's just, from what I said before, it's really, if you think about the span of your life and how many movies, TV shows, commercials, Dare, if you grew, I can't remember if I'm older than you or not, the Dare program.
I remember Dare.
All of these things which all taught you that police were the good guys, right? They're the ones who show up and they chase the bad guy away, or you get hurt and they do the real research and they figure out who hurt you. Like, this is what we've all been taught and propagandized to believe for decades, right? And it's gotten to a point, I'm so bad now with it that I can't even enjoy shows like that anymore, right? Like, the minute it starts turning into like, oh, the cop's gonna solve the crime, I'm like, oh, I can't watch this no more. I can't even enjoy it. But even just the idea that that's what they do, it is just not what they do. And it's important that we break that mythology, that we break that screen, that we clear away the smoke and break all the mirrors and stop the propaganda, and really have these wider conversations about why what people think about policing and what they believe about policing and what they perceive to be what police officers do is not an accurate or truthful reflection of the reality of the situation.
I think that's a really good way to put it. And let's talk about the role that Black Power Media plays in that project of political education. So, for those that don't know, can you explain what Black Power Media is and why you think it's important and powerful in this as part of this movement?
And I hope I do it justice. I'm kind of new over there on them BPM streets. So Black Power Media is a media outlet that is a conglomerate of multiple journalists, media experts, historical experts. It really is a wide range of people who come to the platform and present information on a variety of issues, topics, stories, reflections, books, everything as it relates to Black liberation, right? Because in the end, that's really what it's about. It's trying to ascertain, how do we give the audience the power that is necessary in order for us to actually fight for our freedom and liberation. Um, like I said, I'm relatively new to actually being on screen at BPM. They just celebrated their third year, the third anniversary. So they've been out for 3 years, and really providing a lot of great information. And I feel like the biggest role is to provide a space where people can go and watch different things that are going to teach them something, help them, learn about what organizers are doing, help them to kind of peel back the facade of the propaganda of what media tells, right? Like the Remix Morning Show, and a lot of times, like Dr. Ball will do this, they'll like pull up an article and say, well, here's why this article is complete nonsense, right? Like, look at the wording on this thing. So that's what people can expect from BPM. I really, I sometimes I want to say I'm like surprised that they don't have more of a following, that they don't have more subscribers. And then I remember that if you are really seeking to give people the truth, there's no marketing to that.
Mhm.
Right? Like, marketing the truth is a rough road.
Yeah, but it is an essential road to build those
Yeah.
institutions between the now and the future that help us get to that sort of future of abolition, future of Black sovereignty and Black independence over their own communities. And what I really have loved about watching your show and other shows on Black Power Media is exactly what you say. It's voices that you're not hearing in the rest of the media that are thoughtful. Grounded in the work, grounded in doing the day-to-day work, but also grounded in the thought and the theory and the abstraction that goes behind that work in a way that connects it and starts to give a vision of what is possible,
Mm-hmm.
what is happening now, but also what is possible in ways that it is different. And that's where I want to go with this last question I have, and I know we're getting close to time, but
I think if we go a couple of minutes over, we'll be okay.
okay. I want to talk a little bit about a utopian future, not as an escape from a present, but as an evasion of the work of building these new institutions, but as sort of as a North Star to guide our work toward the world that we want to live in. And so this summer, I came up to an event where you screened Matthew Solomon's Reimagining Safety. Can you talk about that movie, why you're hosting events on it, and sort of a broader vision of what abolition starts to look like once we get past the propaganda of the police state?
Right. So funny story. When you came up and we watched, that was also my first time seeing the movie. I had not seen it before I actually did the screening. Um, but I was intrigued enough after listening to Matthew talk about his like history and how he kind of got to this space of creating the documentary, and the people that he interviewed, the fact that he had someone who had been a trained police officer, who was one of the people that he talked to in his documentary, that he talked to someone from an area where they were able to like actually show why spending money in this way didn't make sense, right? Um, and when I watched it, the thing that I pulled from that documentary that I think I hold with me and I think of every time I talk about it, or, I've now seen it probably 4 or 5 times since that screening, is this idea that we have been conditioned to dial 911 or to call the police for everything. And why do we have to be such shitty neighbors? Right? Like, why do we have to call 911 if someone's having a mental health breakdown? Why do we have to call 911 if the kids are making too much noise in the backyard? Why do we have to call 911 if your neighbor's door seems to be unlocked and open? Right? Like, people bring in, again, and I think I'm going to keep calling them this, these people in costumes with guns, right, into all these scenarios where in any other situation, a person in a costume and a gun with a gun would not be welcomed, right? And so I feel like there's a benefit to really having this conversation within communities about why do we feel the need to bring somebody in wearing a costume and holding a gun? And is there something better that we can do in place of doing that, that maybe would allow for someone to survive a situation where they wouldn't when that person shows up with a gun, right? So, I mean, taking that away from it was really big for me. Um, and this idea that we as communities, because that's what, like I said, I live in a suburb and that's what it's like here, right? Like the alarm is going off next door and it's only after all the neighbors are outside and whoever has the key goes into the house because they're away and the alarm's going off by mistake, and whoever the neighbor who has the key is goes in and can't find the car key and they don't want to break the car window to get the car alarm to stop going, that they actually call 911. Like it takes 2 hours for someone to call a police, and it's like the last ditch effort,
Right.
right? It's the last thing you do on the list, not the first thing you do on the list.
Yeah.
And that's a big differential.
When a couple of weeks ago we were having a conversation, I had a conversation with Dave on Love about juvenile crime and the tough on crime approach that the governor is taking, and it was the same thing. It was the governor wants to make the juvenile justice system the first stop on the pathway to solving the problem, as opposed to the last stop on the pathway to solving the problem. And similarly, in policing, it seems like too often police are the first response that people have to address problems instead of the last response. And, even that sort of simple conceptual move of saying, let's make this the last response instead of the first response, helps to defeat that propaganda. And then when folks understand, well, I don't actually know what to do if my neighbor's alarm is going off, I think it forces them to then be able to go and say, hey, neighbor, what do I do if your alarm goes off?
Right.
And
Right.
and I mean, look, that's not going to solve all problems, right? We still have a world in which today, in the current political order, police have created conditions for a lot of violence, and there's still going to be some times when the police are the actor today that intervenes, right? Like that is going to happen, but the to move to a future where that doesn't happen, we need to stop having them intervene in every single situation, and stop having them be the course of first resort, and stop pouring all the public resources into that as if that is the way to ensure safety.
Right. Because and the other way to ensure safety is to pour resources into the community,
Right.
right? If you live in a place, and not just general resources. Like I was about to start talking about things like if you have access to clean water and you have access to food and you have somewhere to sleep, and you feel like you don't have to do anything extreme to make those previous things happen, right?
Right.
That's a whole different story. But also, if you can go to school and have books and access to the internet and be able to have a conversation where critical thinking and thinking outside the box is welcomed, right? If you're able to, within your own community, go run off your energy because there's a path that you can run on when you're frustrated, right? And so that prevents you from like snapping at somebody who's getting on your nerves in your house, right? Like there are all these things that so many communities are denied, right? And those are the things that actually allow for situations to not be created where you then have to call in the person wearing the costume and holding a gun,
Right.
right? So, it all falls into the same thing. And this thing about like knowing your neighbors and talking to your neighbors and all this, that's also part of the propaganda, because we're all being systematically convinced that our neighbors are bad guys, right? Like your
Or
neighbor's the
might be.
person who could really cause you harm, right?
Right.
Like put the ring on your front door so anybody who walks past your house gets caught on camera, right? Like it's this idea that we constantly have to be in fear of holding on to this thing that we think we own because we don't want someone else to take it from us, and we don't realize that there's, I don't even know, 400 whatever trillion dollars of resources that are held by 1% of the population. And perhaps if instead of worrying about my neighbor picking up my Amazon package when I'm not home, right? Because, they do that because everybody in the neighborhood you can't leave anything on your porch. You just never know. You recognize that the reason you're fighting so hard for this thing is because you spend every day trapped in this system on this spinning wheel of trying to make sure that you can pay for the things, and you feel that way because all of the stuff is owned by like 1% of people, right?
Hmm.
It's a massive misdistribution of the resources and the wealth. And it's a hard thing to get people to understand, right? It's really, really hard. Dr. Ball came to New Jersey and talked to some of my students, and then he talked to the community. And the conversation was really about like economics and capitalism, and what is this black buying power, and all these things. And in every conversation I realize how many people don't understand that they've been duped into believing that they have to really fight to get their piece of the pie, when the reason that they have to do it is because they're a bunch of greedy assholes who are keeping everything. Right?
Right.
If we didn't allow the greedy assholes to keep everything, everybody would have what they needed, and we wouldn't have to feel so burdened by this idea that we have to take and we have to get and we have to hold on and we have to claw. Like it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and it is. And last week I had a really good conversation with Dave on Love about redistribution of both power and both wealth and political power.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if politicians in Annapolis or in Washington, D.C. are deciding that what West Baltimore needs is a $330 million police training facility, that's because they have control over those resources and not the community having control
Right.
over those resources. And if the
Right.
community has the political power to decide where that $330 million goes, it's probably not going into a new police training facility.
Right.
At least all of it. A lot of it is probably going to the things that you talk about, like having recreation within the community and having libraries within the community and having grocery stores and things that make the community healthier, so that it doesn't feel like everybody needs to hustle for the small amount of resources that there are. And I think this redistribution aspect of it is really important, because when we think about that, those price tags, billions of dollars going into these police training facilities, and the people who are being policed have very little say over where that money goes. They may get to vote on a bond, or they may get to elect the people who allocate it. But at the end of the day, they are as far away from those billions of dollars as they are from the decisions about who gets those billions of dollars.
Yep. That's
You
right.
know, and the problem can't be solved by not building police institutions. The problem has to be solved by thinking about a political future where the wealth and the power are distributed differently.
Yep. That's right.
Yep. So,
That's right.
all right, Renee, we are getting close to time here. Is there anything you want to leave with? Final thoughts, or how people can find you?
I am probably easiest to find right there on the Twitter, or Johnston 815, or on Saturdays where Jared is so kind to share his space with me for Saturday with Renee. That shows every Saturday at 11. We try to go live every now and again. We will have to pre-record. Andy will be on with us on Saturday. Very much looking forward to that conversation. And I try to post anything that I have going. That National Lawyers Guild webinar was really, it was a big deal for me, right? Like for the National Lawyers Guild to call me and say, "Can you help with this webinar?" I was truly like, "Wait, me?" Right? And it's opened some doors to some people who are actual resources. They're actual researchers. They actually know how to find information, and I'm really hoping to be able to expand on what I started with people who are able to help me do that, so that we can really lay out some of these things and some of this information that is just really being held tight, because they don't want you to know how many of these resources they're putting in towards something that's not going to be beneficial to the material conditions of the community members.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. We watched that National Lawyers Guild webinar, and I thought it was great. And I thought that your research was really spectacular, and I was excited to have you come on here to talk about it. I'm also excited to see you on Saturday, and we're going to talk about a different set of topics, but similar to the vein we were getting to at the end about who has the power and how people can exert political power, and how both parties are trying to take, and corporations are trying to take that away. So, all right, Renee. Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing you on Saturday again, and we'll switch roles that time. And then I will put a bunch of links into the resources. I'll let you know when this comes out. But thank you so much for this time tonight. I really appreciated it, and it was a great show. So thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. All right. Well, thank you very much to Renee for coming on tonight. We'll get the show out soon. In addition to being able to find the show on YouTube, you can now find it on Spotify, Podbean, Audible, and Apple Podcasts. And we'll make sure that it gets out to all of those places very soon. And we'll put the resources that Renee talked about into the chat. And we have another set of great shows coming up as we get into March. So thank you very much, and have a good night.